time, Walt Whitman's poetry was so far over my head that it might as well have been some sort of 19th century dirigible. Still, it had made an impression, and years later, searching for spiritual guidance, I turned to the dimly remembered volume. I go on to talk in the introduction about how reading biographies of Whitman, I discovered his 19th century disciples. You've heard of one of them, Oscar Wilde, who made a pilgrimage from England to Camden in order to meet Walt Whitman, and wrote a review of Whitman called The Gospel According to Walt Whitman. But there were lots of other people in England, in Canada, and in the US who saw Whitman as a religious figure and his poetry as a source of a radically democratic new American Bible, which is really what I think Whitman thought he was writing. He says, we have a note of his in his manuscripts that says, leaves of grass, the new American Bible. So in the book I tell stories of these disciples, and I'm going to take the story of one of the most famous of one, in part because the story takes place here in Camden, in Philadelphia. An English woman, Anne Gilchrist, who fell in love with Whitman sight unseen and moved her family from London to Philadelphia in order to marry Walt Whitman. It did not work out, but it's an amazing story, and I'm going to tell you read a little bit of that story from Worshipping Walt, which is a series of group biographies of these wonderful, colorful disciples. The lobby of the Montgomery House Hotel in Philadelphia was bustling with activity on September 13, 1876. In addition to the usual contingent of businessmen and commercial travelers, Philadelphia's hotels were filled with tourists who had come to see the celebrated Centennial Exposition in Fairmount Park, the grandiose 100th birthday party that the United States was throwing for itself. Few of those hurrying through the Montgomery House parlor would have noticed the plump, middle-aged Englishwoman seated in a corner, obviously waiting for someone. She seemed a completely conventional, soberly dressed matron. No one could have guessed that Anne Gilchrist, 48 years old, was expecting the love of her life. That the two had not yet met seemed to her a minor detail. Her soulmate was Walt Whitman. She had encountered him through his poetry, which she first read in 1869, 8 years after she had been widowed in London at the age of 33, with 4 young children to raise. A woman of letters from a genteel family, she supported herself on a small inheritance and the royalties from a biography of William Blake that she had completed her husband after his death. Her response to Leaves of Grass had been immediate and overwhelming. Quote, I had not dreamed that words could cease to be words and become electric streams like these, she wrote to her friend William Michael Rossetti. I do assure you that, strong as I am, I feel sometimes as if I had not bodily strength to read many of these poems. Her reaction to the poems was physical and deeply sexual, though the language of her letters to Rossetti was veiled. She was more direct when 2 years after first reading Whitman, she obtained his address from Rossetti and wrote him a letter. Dear friend, she began, decorously enough, but within a few pages her tone was panting, ecstatic. Oh, come, my darling. Look into these eyes and see the loving, ardent, inspiring soul in them. Easily will you learn to love all the rest of me for the sake of that, and take me to your breast forever and ever. When Whitman failed to respond, she wrote him a second letter, this one more ardent and certainly more explicit about her desires. Quote, I am yet young enough to bear thee children, my darling. Whitman was finally jolted into action, and he wrote what he hoped would be a placating reply. Brief, tactful, vague, an attempt to move from his correspondent's intensely personal plane to the safely general. I am not insensible to your love. I too send you my love. And do you feel no disappointment because I write now so briefly? My book is my best letter, my response, my truest explanation of all. But Anne Gilchrist would not be put off so easily. She continued her ardent letters for the next 5 years, at which point she set sail for America, bringing with her 3 of her 4 children, her pianoforte, and a house full of good furniture. She intended to set up housekeeping as Walt Whitman's wife. In his lifetime, he received countless romance-tinged letters from women who responded to the erotically charged invitations throughout Lisa Grass. And Gilchrist happened to be one of the first, and certainly the most serious among them. Neither he nor Gilchrist ever described their first meeting, yet it is clear what must have happened. At this supreme test of her life, Anne Gilchrist somehow summoned the courage to behave with extraordinary strength and wisdom. She managed to overcome all her expectations and nervousness, was able to set aside the speeches that she must have rehearsed, the gestures she must have practiced. Oh, I could not live if I did not believe that sooner or later you will not be able to help stretching out your arms towards me and saying, "Come, my darling," she had written to him. But the large, white-haired, gentle man who stood before her did not take her into his arms, did not address her as darling. He was kindness itself, but there was not a hint of romantic attraction, not a glimmer of erotic fire in his greeting. She somehow managed to set aside 7 years' worth of hopes and dreams. She and Whitman would be friends, just friends.